The HOA hadn't seen what was coming. None of them had. They'd spent an entire winter burying Corvin Steele's property under mountains of displaced snow, plowing it off the road, off the common areas, off everyone else's driveways, and dumping it all against his fence, his gate, his mailbox, until his entire front yard became a glacier. They thought he would complain, file a report, maybe move. They did not think he would wait. They did not think he would measure. They did not think that a man who spent 22 years as a structural engineer could look at 4 months of packed ice and see not a problem, but a blueprint. Part 1. The first snow of the season had come on a Tuesday in November, quiet and ordinary, the kind that dusts the branches and makes children press their faces to cold glass. Corvin Steele had watched it from his kitchen window with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand, not because the snow was beautiful, though it was, but because he had a feeling. The kind of feeling that lives in the chest rather than the mind, low and steady, like a pilot light that never goes out. He had moved to Whitmore Pines 11 months earlier, and in those 11 months, he had learned a great deal about his neighbors. Not the kind of learning that comes from conversation, from borrowed sugar or shared fences, but the kind that comes from watching, from listening through walls that were thinner than the builder had advertised, from reading the tone of a wave that was technically friendly but carried the temperature of February even in June. The Whitmore Pines Homeowners Association had 12 members on its board. 3 of them mattered. Dorothea Hale was the president, a woman in her mid-60s with silver hair cut to a severe jaw and a voice that had been honed over decades into something that could pass for warmth while delivering ice. She had lived in Whitmore Pines for 19 years and treated that tenure the way some people treat military rank, as a permanent credential that entitled her to deference. Gerald Marsh was the vice president, a former insurance adjuster who had transferred all the habits of claims investigation into the governance of a residential community of 43 homes. He documented everything. He photographed everything. He sent letters with return receipt requested. And then there was Paula Vince, the treasurer, who was not the cruelest of the 3, but was perhaps the most dangerous because she was the most convinced of her own reasonableness. Paula believed, with genuine sincerity, that everything the board did was fair. This belief made her immovable. Corvin had first encountered the board formally at the October meeting, 2 months before the snow. He had purchased the property at 14 Ridgeline Court from an estate. The previous owner, an elderly man named Arthur Forsyth, had died without children, and the house had sat empty for 8 months before Corvin's offer closed. It was a corner lot, larger than most in the development, with a long driveway that ran parallel to the main interior road and a back fence that bordered the undeveloped greenbelt that the HOA technically maintained but practically ignored. The house itself was solid. Good bones, as the inspector had said, which was a phrase Corvin appreciated because he had spent his career thinking in bones. Steel and concrete, load-bearing and tension, the hidden architecture that kept things standing when everything visible threatened to collapse. At the October meeting, Dorothea had welcomed him with a smile that reached her cheekbones but not her eyes. She had introduced him to the room as our new neighbor at 14 Ridgeline, and then had smoothly, almost seamlessly, moved the conversation toward a series of what she called orientation items. A folder of HOA documents she slid across the table toward him with the manner of a prosecutor presenting evidence. The documents outlined snow removal protocols. They outlined seasonal decorating guidelines. They outlined fence height restrictions, driveway material approvals, and a parking policy that Corvin was fairly certain had been written by someone who had once been personally wronged by a pickup truck. He had read every page. He had asked 2 questions, both of which were answered with the particular patience that is indistinguishable from condescension. He had thanked them and driven home. In November, the first snow came and the HOA's contracted plow service arrived at 4 in the morning. Corvin heard it from his bedroom, the grinding scrape of the blade on the asphalt, the growl of the diesel engine working through the development's interior roads. He went back to sleep. In the morning, he looked out his front window and saw that the plow had cleared the road alongside his property with admirable efficiency and had deposited the cleared snow in a long ridge along the edge of his front lawn. This was not, in itself, unusual. Snow had to go somewhere. What was unusual was the volume. The ridge ran nearly 30 feet along his property line and rose to almost 3 feet in height, while the other corner lots in the development, he noticed on his morning walk, had received no such deposits. Their curb lines were clean. The snow from their frontages had been directed toward the storm drains and the greenbelt margins. Only his corner, the largest corner, the one with the most frontage, had been chosen as the repository. He mentioned it to Gerald Marsh 2 days later when he saw Gerald checking his mailbox. Gerald listened with his head slightly tilted, the way people tilt their heads when they have already formulated their response and are waiting for you to finish. He said the plow drivers used their judgment about snow placement and that the board didn't micromanage the contractors. He said it with a shrug that was so practiced it had become unconscious. Corvin thanked him and went inside. The second snow came in December, heavier, and the ridge along his property became a wall. Then the third, after Christmas, and the wall became a berm. By the time January arrived and delivered 3 consecutive storms in 18 days, the accumulated snow along Corvin's front property line had grown to a structure that was, in places, nearly 6 feet tall and 40 feet long. It blocked his view of the street from his porch. It pressed against his decorative iron fence hard enough that 2 of the vertical pickets had bent inward. His mailbox was buried to the flag. Delivery drivers were leaving packages at the end of the neighbor's driveway, 50 feet away, because the approach to his address was a canyon. He had called the HOA office, a voicemail box in practice, 4 times. He had sent 2 written letters. He had attended the January board meeting and spoken during the public comment period, presenting photographs he had organized chronologically to demonstrate the progression. Paula Vince had looked at his photographs with an expression of genuine concern that resolved, over the following 3 minutes, into a gentle explanation of why the board's hands were tied by the plow contractor's operational discretion. Dorothea had thanked him for bringing his concerns forward. Gerald had taken notes in a small leather notebook and said nothing. 2 days after the January meeting, the plow came again and the berm grew another 2 feet. Corvin Steele was not by nature a reactive man. His career had been built on the discipline of patience, on the understanding that structural problems rarely announce themselves loudly. They accumulated, they propagated through materials in ways that were invisible until they were catastrophic. He had learned to read the slow language of stress and load, and he had learned that the best responses to structural challenges were rarely the most immediate ones. They were the ones that understood the geometry of the situation completely before committing to a solution. He began measuring in February. He measured the berm daily, its length, its height at 12-foot intervals, its density. He photographed it in morning light and afternoon light and under the flat gray of overcast days. He noted the temperatures, the freeze-thaw cycles, the rate of compression as new snow compacted the old. He pulled his structural engineering references from the boxes he still hadn't fully unpacked, not because he needed them exactly, but because the act of consulting them felt like the correct ceremony for the work he was beginning to plan. His corner lot sat at the intersection of Ridgeline Court and the development's main loop road, Whitmore Drive. The HOA's administrative hub, a converted 2-car garage at number 22 Whitmore Drive that served as the board's meeting space, document archive, and the location of the development's only guest parking area, sat diagonally across from his corner, perhaps 60 feet away at its nearest point. The guest parking area was accessed by a single curb cut on Whitmore Drive, directly in line with the gap in Corvin's berm where his driveway met the road. He began to understand the geometry. The HOA's governing documents, which Corvin had read with the thoroughness he applied to engineering specifications, contained a provision in Section 14, Paragraph C, Subsection 3, that had been inserted, he suspected by Gerald Marsh's precise, paranoid hand, to address the issue of snow storage during clearing operations. The provision stated, in language that was almost elegant in its vagueness, that homeowners may store snow resulting from private driveway clearing operations in any location within their property boundaries, provided such storage does not constitute a permanent structure and does not impede emergency access or public right-of-way. The provision had been written to allow homeowners to pile snow wherever they liked on their own property. It had been written, Corvin now understood, with the confidence of people who had never imagined it being used against them. He spent February planning. He went to the library and checked out 3 books on ice construction, not because he expected to build anything as ambitious as the ice hotels he'd read about in Scandinavia, but because the principles of stabilized ice architecture were directly applicable to what he had in mind. He ordered 3 commercial misting attachments for his garden hose system. He contacted a supplier in Manitoba through a professional engineering contact and requested specifications on a layered ice reinforcement technique that had been developed for winter road construction in remote northern conditions. The technique involved alternating layers of compacted snow and misted water, each layer allowed to freeze before the next was added, producing a composite material with load-bearing properties significantly superior to natural snowpack. He also hired an attorney. Her name was Serena Park, and she had been recommended to him by a colleague who described her as the kind of lawyer the other side doesn't realize they should be afraid of until it's too late. She was 38, precise in her speech, and she read the Whitmore Pines HOA governing documents the way a pathologist reads an autopsy report, looking not for what was obvious, but for what the documents were trying to conceal. She called Corvin on a Thursday evening in the third week of February and told him she had found 4 separate procedural violations in the board's conduct over the preceding 3 months, 2 of which were potentially actionable under the state's Planned Community Act, and one of which, the systematic redirection of plow-cleared snow onto a single homeowner's property in a pattern inconsistent with the treatment of comparable lots, was, in her assessment, an abuse of HOA authority that met the threshold for selective enforcement claims. Corvin listened to all of this and then asked one question. How long do we wait before filing? Serena was quiet for a moment. That depends. What are you planning to do? He told her. She was quiet for longer this time. Then she said, I need you to understand that what you're describing is legal, but the HOA will absolutely try to claim it isn't. I know. They'll try to invoke the nuisance provisions. They'll claim sightline obstruction. The sightline provisions apply to permanent structures. Ice isn't a permanent structure. It melts. They'll say it's a hazard. I'll have an engineering assessment documenting that it meets all load-bearing and structural safety standards and presents no greater hazard than the existing berm, which they created. Another pause. You've thought about this. I'm a structural engineer. Thinking about this is what I do. She laughed, a short, surprised sound. All right, we file the notice of intent to pursue selective enforcement claims on the day you begin construction. That puts them in a position where any action they take against you can be characterized as retaliation. That's what I thought. One more thing, she said. Make it impressive. If this ends up in front of a judge or a jury, you want them to understand immediately that this wasn't petty, that it was proportional. Corvin looked out his window at the berm, 6 feet high, 40 feet long, packed into something that was more ice than snow now, blue-gray in the moonlight, solid as a decision that had already been made. It'll be impressive, he said. By the last day of February, he was ready to begin. He had arranged for 2 of his former graduate students, both now practicing engineers, both of whom owed him professional favors, and found the project amusing in the particular way that engineers find elegant solutions amusing, to assist him over the first weekend of March. He had the misting system installed along the top of the existing berm. He had the layering materials staged. He had Serena Park's letter ready to be delivered to the HOA board the morning work began. The existing berm was his foundation. 4 months of compacted, redirected snow, frozen and refrozen through January and February's cycles, had produced a base structure with surprising integrity. Corvin's measurements indicated it could support additional load. The plan was not to build the wall taller, not primarily. The plan was to build it wider, denser, and above all, to extend it. The existing structure ran along his front property line. His plan extended it around the corner, along the side property line facing Whitmore Drive, closing the gap between his front structure and the side fence in a continuous arc that would, when complete, entirely enclose the approach to his property and, more significantly, entirely enclose the approach to the guest parking area of the HOA administrative hub. This was the geometry. His property's corner location meant that his property lines formed a right angle at the intersection. The HOA hub's access point, its single curb cut on Whitmore Drive, sat in the exact wedge of that angle, between his front property line and his side property line. To access it, vehicles had to pass through a corridor of road that was bordered on one side by his property and on the other by the development's entrance landscaping. If he extended his wall to its natural conclusion along both property lines, maintaining a structure entirely within his own land, the corridor would be physically enclosed. Not blocked, the road would remain open, but enclosed in a way that would feel and would be like passing through a gate that only one person controlled. He did not block the road. That would have been illegal. He built his wall on his property, right up to the property line, right up to the legal boundary, and not 1 inch beyond. The road remained. The curb cut remained. What changed was the experience of approaching it. The 6-foot ice wall that now rose on one side of the 40-foot approach corridor, white and dense and absolutely deliberately present. He finished the primary structure on the second Sunday of March. His graduate students, Marin and Tiago, had proven invaluable. Marin for her precision with the misting layers, Tiago for his talent with ice reinforcement and his cheerful willingness to work in 20-degree weather at 7 in the morning. By noon on that Sunday, the wall ran 112 feet along Corvin's front and side property lines. It was 6 feet 4 inches high at its tallest point, tapering to 5 feet at the ends where it met his existing fence lines. Its outer face, the face visible from the road, had been finished with a misting technique that produced a surface as smooth as polished concrete. In the afternoon sun, it threw light like a prism. Corvin stood at the end of his driveway and looked at it for a long time. Then he went inside and called Serena Park. It's done, he said. How does it look? He thought about this. Like exactly what it is, he said. Which is the point. She filed the notice of intent the following morning. Dorothea Hale called him at 8:43 that same morning. He let it go to voicemail. She called again at 9:15. He let that go too. The message she left was controlled, but not entirely. The surface of her voice was its usual composed temperature, but underneath it, something moved, something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't quite not anger either. She said she needed to discuss an urgent matter regarding his property. She said the board had received several concerns from residents. She said she hoped they could resolve this cooperatively. He called her back at 2 in the afternoon. Corvin Steele, he said when she answered. Mr. Steele. A pause, brief, the kind used to collect oneself. I'm sure you know why I'm calling. I assume it's about my property improvements. Improvements. The word landed flat. Mr. Steele, you've constructed a barrier along your property lines. I've stored snow on my property, yes, in accordance with Section 14, Paragraph C, Subsection 3 of the governing documents. A longer pause. This is not what that provision was designed for. The provision says homeowners may store snow resulting from private driveway clearing operations in any location within their property boundaries. I cleared my driveway. I stored the snow. It's within my property boundaries. The scale of this is proportional to the scale of what was deposited on my property over the preceding 4 months, which I have documented in photographs with dates and measurements, and which my attorney has described as a systematic pattern of selective enforcement that she is currently preparing to bring to the attention of the State Housing Authority. The silence this time was different. It had texture. Your attorney, Dorothea said. Yes, you should have received her letter this morning. A very long pause. When Dorothea spoke again, the composure was back, but it was the kind of composure that has been reassembled rather than maintained. I think it would be best if we scheduled a meeting. I agree, Corvin said. My attorney will be in touch to coordinate scheduling. He hung up and looked out the window at his wall, white and bright in the March afternoon, and felt the particular satisfaction of a structure that was exactly as strong as it needed to be. That evening, his neighbor across the street, a quiet man named Howard Beam who had never been involved in the HOA dispute and who had always waved from his driveway with genuine friendliness, came to Corvin's door with a bottle of good bourbon and a look on his face that was trying very hard not to be a grin. I want you to know, Howard said, that I have been waiting for someone to do something like this for 6 years. He held out the bottle. Corvin accepted it. They stood on the porch in the cold for a while, looking at the wall together. Corvin had not felt, in all the months since he had moved to Whitmore Pines, like he particularly belonged there. He felt something close to it now, standing in the cold with a good bottle and a neighbor who understood what he was looking at. The wall stood through the night. In the morning, it stood still. By then, the HOA board had held an emergency session. He learned this from Howard, who had an informant of sorts in Paula Vince's book club, and had begun to realize, with the specific horror of people encountering a trap they walked into entirely themselves, exactly what the geometry of the situation meant. Part 2. The emergency session of the Whitmore Pines HOA board had lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes, which Gerald Marsh noted in the minutes with his customary precision, and which Paula Vince would later describe to her book club as the most uncomfortable evening of my adult life. Dorothea had opened the meeting by projecting Corvin's photographs onto the wall of the converted garage. Her photographs, the ones his attorney had included with the notice of intent, documenting the progression of the snow berm from the first plow event in November to the 6-foot glacier in February. She showed them without comment, which was worse than if she had commented, because the silence let each image speak at its own pace. Gerald had looked at his phone. Paula had looked at her hands. Then Dorothea had shown them the photographs of Corvin's completed wall. Paula had made a sound that was not quite a word. Gerald had put his phone face down on the table. He built it on his property, Dorothea said. Every inch. The sightline provision, Gerald started, doesn't apply to ice. It applies to fences, walls, and structures. Ice is not legally a structure. It's temporary. It doesn't look temporary. It isn't, Dorothea said, which was the most honest thing she would say all evening. His attorney is arguing selective enforcement. She has our plow records. She got them through the public records request she filed 3 weeks ago. She paused. Which means she filed that request before he built the wall. Which means this has been planned since at least February, Paula said quietly. Probably January. Gerald picked up his phone again, looked at it, put it down, What does our HOA attorney say? Brian says our exposure on the selective enforcement claim is real. He says the plow records show a consistent pattern over 4 months that's hard to characterize as anything other than intentional. Dorothea's voice remained level, but the effort required to keep it level was to anyone paying attention, visible. He also says that the Section 14 provision is exactly as clear as Mr. Steele says it is, and that we wrote it, and that a judge will not be sympathetic to us arguing that a provision we wrote means something other than what it says. So we can't make him take it down, Paula said. Not without triggering a retaliation claim on top of the selective enforcement claim. And the wall blocks the guest parking access. No, Dorothea said carefully. It doesn't block it. The road is open. The curb cut is accessible. The wall is on his property, not on the road. But you feel like you can't get through, Paula said. You can get through. Dorothea, you know what I mean. What Paula meant was this. The physical reality of the wall had changed the experience of the HOA Administrative Hub's parking area in a way that was difficult to articulate legally, but impossible to ignore physically. The approach corridor, 40 feet of two-lane road between Corvin's wall and the entrance landscaping, was technically unobstructed. Legally, nothing had changed. Experientially, passing through it felt like entering a place you had not been invited. The white wall on the left, smooth and high, threw shadow across the corridor in the morning. In the afternoon, it reflected light with an intensity that required sunglasses. In the evening, it held the day's cold in a way that dropped the temperature of the corridor by several degrees. 3 board members who had attempted to use the guest parking area in the day since the wall was completed had, independently, turned around before reaching the curb cut. Not because they couldn't get through. Because it felt like they shouldn't. This was not an accident. Corvin understood something about the psychology of space that most people don't consciously articulate but viscerally experience. Built environment shapes behavior. Walls communicate, boundaries speak. He had spent his career understanding the way structures affected the humans who moved through them, and he had applied that understanding here with the precision of a man who had had 4 months of cold mornings to think about nothing else. The board did not, at this emergency session, arrive at a resolution. They arrived instead at a state of suspended helplessness that was entirely new to all 3 of them. Dorothea was accustomed to being the person who defined the terms of engagement in Whitmore Pines. Gerald was accustomed to being the person who documented compliance and non-compliance from a position of institutional authority. Paula was accustomed to being the person who smoothed things over, who translated conflict into procedure, who made unpleasant things feel reasonable. None of these roles were available to them now. The man at 14 Ridgeline had not broken a rule. He had read the rules more carefully than the people who wrote them, and he had used that reading to produce a situation in which all of the board's tools were pointed in the wrong direction. Gerald spent the following 2 days researching case law on HOA disputes, ice structures, temporary installations, and sightline ordinances. He called Brian, their HOA attorney, 4 times. Brian was patient, but consistent. There was no legal avenue to compel removal of the wall without first resolving the selective enforcement claim. And resolving the selective enforcement claim meant acknowledging that the plow redirection had been improper, which opened the board to liability for the damage to Corvin's fence pickets, his mailbox, and any other documented property impact from the 4 months of accumulated snow. Gerald prepared a memo. The memo was 14 pages. It reached no conclusions. Meanwhile, Corvin went about his life with the focused calm of a man who has completed the primary phase of a project and is now in the